Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge first Lieutenant Governor Den, members of my cabinet, including Director Vasali, who will handle most of the presentation today, Secretary of State Bullock, Secretary of Finance Cook, Secretary of Transportation Batt. Am I missing any other? Secretary of Education Murphy and Commissioner of Correction Coop. I see a lot of legislators in the room. I want to thank them for coming, acknowledge them. I see Representative Ramon, Senator Lavelle, Senator Lopez, Senator Sicola, Representative Bombach, Representative Moreau, Representative Briggs-King, Representative Kenton and Wilson and Dukes and Gray and Hudson and Short. Is it everybody? Okay. Well, thanks for coming. In my State of the State address last week, I said that every Delawarean has something to contribute if given the chance. And we need to make sure that they have that chance for their sake and also because we all stand to gain when everyone gets a fair shot. Many of the specific initiatives I mentioned in that speech are part of today's presentation, and we can make real opportunities a reality for all by ensuring that our budget reflects our values. And so the budget that we're presenting today adheres to the value of fiscal responsibility. It continues an approach that has earned us a AAA credit rating by using only 98% of available revenues and fully funding our rainy day fund. And at the same time, we must recognize that we've got to invest in areas that we know are critical to creating economic opportunity now and for generations to come. This budget funds important education and job training to strengthen our workforce. It supports research that spurs innovation and economic development. It creates programs to give our most vulnerable citizens and communities a better chance. And yesterday we detailed our plan for a stronger transportation network that's necessary for our businesses' success and to provide a high quality of life for all of our people. And making these investments requires hard choices, including a mix of cuts and new revenues to support our priorities. However, if we're going to have a lasting impact in creating opportunities for our fellow citizens, we must take the same challenge that President Kennedy issued in Delaware just over 50 years ago when he dedicated the new 59-mile highway running from Wilmington to Baltimore. He recognized that the tremendous benefits of the highway were made possible because of a commitment that had been made years earlier. And he called on Americans, and this is a quote, to begin today, this year, this decade, the things which will make this country a better place to live in for the rest of the century. So by strengthening our infrastructure and spurring innovation, by supporting our schools and developing a quality workforce, by giving everyone a chance to contribute, we'll begin the things that make our state a better place and ensure that we keep Delaware moving forward. So with that, I'd like to ask Director Vasali to lead us through the rest of the presentation. I may jump up or have Lieutenant Governor jump up here and there, and then of course we'll be happy to take a few questions.
Thank you, Governor. I apologize in advance for my my voice. I'll do the best I can, get through the presentation. Please have sympathy for me. So this first slide really takes us to our starting point in developing the budget. The December DFAC estimate is the estimate that the administration uses to begin to craft the budget. At 98%, we had $3.8 billion available. However, comparing that to the current year's three money bills, our total appropriations were $3.823. So we began $13 million short in revenue for next year to cover the current year's three money bills. As we proceed in the budget development, we look at the cost increases throughout government as well as initiatives and other investments that we're making. The first item that we programmed in for funding was a 1% pay raise for all state employees. So this is a 1% across the board pay raise at a cost of $15.6 million. Next includes education steps and the third year of paraprofessional pay plan that advances paraprofessionals in the classroom through a new pay plan. In addition, we have other personnel related costs in this category. As we move into the category of education, one of the more significant items was the increase in enrollment in traditional public and charter schools. So we've seen an increase of students into the state, an increase of students in the private schools, and an increase in students moving from private into public schools. So that number is close to $19 million to fund 220 teacher units throughout the public school system. In addition, we have related increases that are formulaic throughout education, including due to the increased enrollment, pupil transportation, equalization, academic excellence growth. In addition, the next items that were also mentioned in the Governor's State of the State, teacher and leader development, as well as the College Access Program to improve access to higher education and better prepare our high school students to go on to college. $23.9 million was added to the Medicaid budget, and $17 million is budgeted in anticipation of our next bond sale. In the Department of Health and Social Services, we added $5.6 million to provide services and placements in the community for people with developmental disabilities, as well as those individuals aging out of the public school system and into the adult population. $3.6 million for community-based services for individuals with serious and persistent mental illness. $2 million, which was one of the things the governor mentioned, for people with addictions, substance use and disorder services in the Department of Health and Social Services. $1.3 million for a new program, the Nurse Family Partnership, which we'll talk about in a couple minutes, and other health items throughout health and social services. The remaining category funds a variety of operational issues throughout state government, and also included in here is $1 million for the Workforce Development Initiative, which is a partnership between the private sector, the Department of Labor, providing grants, experiential learning, credit, and certificates in the areas of manufacturing and high-tech training. So with our total costs and our very minimal new initiatives, which you can see, the total of the new initiatives, most of which were mentioned in the State of the State, amount to just over $7 million, which is 0.199% of the budget. So less than 0.2% is the new initiatives that were within the budget.
So let me just take a minute on this slide, because I'm not going to go over each one in detail, but this does tie just about everything on here was something that I mentioned in the State of the State in terms of new initiatives. I believe that in terms of the new initiatives I mentioned, it's basically this list plus the transportation enhancements, which we talked about yesterday in detail. I also mentioned in the State of the State the Clean Water for Delaware's Future initiative. We'll be sharing more details about that in the next couple of weeks. But I think everything else that I mentioned in terms of the state, in terms of the tie to any funding, it's on this slide. As I said, I'm not going to go over each one, but as an example, the Nurse Family Partnership, one is something that the Lieutenant Governor was very involved in helping us put together. I wanted him just to take a moment to explain that. Some of the other ones that you see here, the pretrial supervision, I mentioned last week, and this has to do with the fact that so many of the people who are incarcerated are pretrial detainees. 40% of the women at Baylor are pretrial detainees, and Commissioner Koop spent a lot of time looking around the country for best practices, and he has recommended that we implement a pilot program that's modeled off of a program in New York to have these people supervised in the community rather than into prison for a certain group of them. So that is one example. We also talked about doing a better job for the young people who were coming out of Ferris and the like. That's here as well. But let the Lieutenant Governor take a moment on the Nurse Family Partnership. But again, as Director Vasali said, as you can see, these initiatives adding up to about $7.5 million, less than 0.2% of the budget.
The Nurse Family Partnership is really the next step in an effort we've been making over the last few years to invest more money in children before they reach kindergarten age. I think you've several times heard the governor and I talk about the major implications that how we do for our kids before they reach kindergarten age has for them through high school and through adulthood. And the General Assembly and the governor invested a lot of money over the last couple of years in quality early childhood development. This Nurse Family Partnership is a program that is focused upon women who are on Medicaid who are having their first children. We have about 2,000 women on Medicaid in the state every year who have their first children, and these are kids who were born into situations that absent some extra care from the state might be more challenging for their kids. It's a national program that has had tremendous results in terms of reducing dropout rates when kids reach school age, reducing incidents of child abuse, helping kids meet language and other developmental benchmarks, double-digit improvements by almost every measure over the 20-plus years that the program has been in existence. We've had it in Delaware for the last couple of years for about 200 of those 2,000 mothers who have their first children. And what this budget will propose to do is to move us from 200 mothers per year to 500 mothers per year. So we will have 25% of all first-time births to low-income mothers have this program, which involves registered nurses visiting the home starting in the first trimester of pregnancy and continuing up to between 18 and 24 months of the child's age, and providing a variety of support services and counseling for the parent that results in those great outcomes. And what that will do for us in terms of our national status is we will become the top state in the country in terms of the percentage of first-time mothers on Medicaid who receive these nurse visits. So it's going to put us in very good standing in terms of how we get these kids started. And obviously for those hundreds of kids every year, it's going to get them off to a great start before they get to kindergarten age.
Thank you, Matt. So back to the math. As we began, we were short $13.1 million. The list of items that we just went through in terms of cost and the $7.5 million of new initiatives totals $125.9. So when you take those two items together, you have a budget gap of $139 million. Our process for closing this budget gap consists of a few different components. The first is reductions, reallocations, and special funds. This amounts to $33 million. This can include things, for example, one-time items that are in the current budget in FY14 that don't need to be funded in FY15. Cash that was put towards the bond bill that isn't being recommended in FY15, but rather back into the general fund. Agency and program cuts of $56.5 million, which I'll identify on the next slide. The $56.5 million is derived from the following: $40 million from the Transportation Trust Fund. These numbers are at 98%, so when we put it into the general fund, it gets reduced just a bit. $8 million, or 7.8, from the Open Space Fund, which leaves $2 million for open space. $7.8 million from Farmland Preservation, which leaves $2 million in that program. And $1.5 million from the Energy Efficiency Fund, which leaves $3.4 million in that fund. So in closing our gap, this takes us down to a remaining $49.5 million left to be closed. And with that, I'm going to ask Secretary of State Bullock to come and talk about our proposal to close the remaining 49.5.
Thank you, Ann. So we will make two proposals related to the fees we collect in the area of incorporations and entity formation. The first will be to increase limited liability companies and other alternative entity fees from $250 to $300 annually. That'll raise about $33 million. There are about 750,000 of those entities that are formed in our state right now. We will also propose to increase the minimum on the corporate franchise tax from $75 to $175. That tax has been held artificially low for a number of years, and we're trying to get it up closer to what we charge for LLCs. There are about 220,000 or so entities that will be affected by that. It'll raise about $18 million. About 90% of this $51 million that we propose to raise in these two ways will be exported outside of our state, which is to say that companies not in Delaware will pay those additional fees.
Thank you, Jeff. So back to the math. That proposal, which will generate at 98% $50 million, actually leaves us about $500,000 to the good. And our recommendation is that that money be added to the money set aside for the grants and aid bill, which is crafted by the General Assembly. And so in addition to the $44.7 million already set aside for grants and aid, we would add this for a total of $45.2 million for the grants and aid, which gets us to our balanced budget bottom line of 0. Moving on now to the capital plan. $22.2 million is identified for the strategic fund, and you can see a sampling below of some of the companies statewide that have either located to Delaware, grown, or retained jobs as a result of the assistance of the strategic fund and the Delaware Economic Development Office. We're recommending $10 million for the Port of Wilmington towards a new container crane at the port. $3.1 million for the Riverfront Development Corporation, which is the riverfront in Wilmington. The next two items were also mentioned during the Governor's State of the State. $3 million to assist in the planning and design of the Delaware Cyber Initiative. This is an initiative involving all 3 higher education institutions, as well as the Delaware National Guard and the private sector, to really create not just a stream of employees where there are jobs going unfilled in this industry, but also to stimulate and generate some of the cutting-edge research in this area that's needed. $2 million for Federal Research and Development Matching Grant Program. This is really early stage research going on in our higher education institutions that needs to get to the next level to be able to leverage some of the federal money that is available for them as matching grant opportunities. So this $2 million will go a long way to help stimulate that. In the area of public education, the bond bill contains a recommendation of $92.6 million. Approximately $10.8 million of that funding is for minor capital improvements, and the remainder goes for major construction and new schools. And you can see some of the schools identified in the slide, school districts. $16.5 million for higher education. This represents $5.5 million for each of the 3 higher eds. $7 million is recommended to promote the rehabilitation and construction in designated downtown development districts. The governor did mention this program. This is a new initiative funded in the bond bill, and he did mention this in the State of the State. And $6 million in this Delaware State Housing Authority added to the $4 million in the operating budget for the Housing Development Fund. $4.2 million is recommended for library construction statewide, and that includes libraries in Delmar, the new library in Lewis, the Route 9 and 13 library in Garfield Park area, and library in Harrington. $2.9 million for the redevelopment of strategic sites, and that includes the NVF Fort DuPont sites, and $2.7 million for statewide trails and pathways. We are recommending $3 million for the completion of the new Troop 3 in Camden, and $1.7 million for renovations to the Delaware Guard Readiness Center in Newport. Throughout the state buildings, we're recommending $25 million for minor capital improvements as well as maintenance and restoration funds. And finally, $14.8 million for statewide facility improvements, which can include things like roofs, other larger capital renovations. And so this final slide sums up the financial plan. As you can see, you have the operating fund budget at $3.829 billion, the trust fund budget at $342.2, grants and aid at $45.2, and the bond bill at $460.9. And this budget represents just a 3% increase over FY15. So thank you. That concludes my formal presentation, and I think, looking for Kathy or Jessica, we'll take a few questions. Thank you.
On your 1% salary increase, does that include the steps for the teachers, or is that going to be a separate item?
It's a separate item.
And the steps are recommended. Roughly 50% of teachers receive steps every year, and those are recommended as a separate line item. In addition, the scales will move 1% with the 1% pay increase.
Well, let's just do a little history of the pay. So in 2009, when we were dealing with the catastrophic financial situation, every state employee took a 2.5% pay cut. That was for fiscal 10. For fiscal 11, that was restored. So they were basically back even in fiscal 12. There was a 2% increase. Fiscal 13, there was a 1% increase. And in the current fiscal year, there was no increase. And so we, think it's important that we continue to retain and attract high-quality state employees because of the incredibly important work that they do. And we want to make sure that we have a compensation package that is, that is as competitive as it can be. And of course, also recognizing the work that they do as well. So it's something that we have, wanted to do, and we, 1% certainly not a ton, but it's a step in the right direction.
In your new initiatives section, do you have new state employees built into that?
We are down 530 state employees from day one. And we've gone back all the way to 1976, and we are the first administration during that time to be down anywhere near that number. I'd have to go through. There are a few of those initiatives, I think, which would require state employees. I'd have to go down sort of program by program. I think some of it may be contracted out, but that's something that obviously during the JFC process we'll discuss. But I do think, particularly for members of the General Assembly, to focus on that 530 number. I mean, the fact is state employees have been doing more with less. We have been, it's obviously something that we focused a lot on during given the financial challenges that we faced. And I think it would probably be worthwhile at some point to go over with members of the General Assembly where those changes have taken place over the last few years and where we've reduced. We've done it without layoffs, which we think has been important. We've done it by managing attrition very carefully.
And that would be good to have Ann, perhaps you could get that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if I may, just to follow up on the governor's comments, the decrease of 530 people is it excludes education, so it excludes the teachers. As you saw, we're adding 220 new teacher units this year, so that excludes education in that number. And in addition, in areas where we have added positions, state troopers, for example, is a really good example. We've tried to take additional reductions elsewhere in state government. So, for example, in the Office of Management and Budget, we've greatly reduced the paper printing that we do throughout state government. I had a question yesterday about the old budget books that we used to print. So when we have attrition, because we haven't done any layoffs, we might take that position and reallocate it somewhere else in state government to be able to hold the line on position growth throughout the state.
And just to be clear, as I said, we've gone back to 1976, and we are the first administration, including Governor Minner, Governor Carper, Governor Castle, Governor DuPont, to be down anywhere near this kind of number during that time.
Yes, Governor. Thank you. I'm very appreciative of seeing your revenue recovery strata, where you're going to have a raise in the LLC fee and minimum corporate tax. Was there any consideration given as a fallback plan to, instead of raising the entire minimum, which I don't think is asking too much, the minimum tax, to raising the cap again on the corporate tax?
I'd prefer to let Secretary Bullock answer that question, but what I can tell you, and I think it's important for people to understand, is that before we would be in a position to recommend something like this, Secretary Bullock and his team do a significant amount of outreach. We are very proud of the premier position that Delaware plays in corporate governance. It's something that we have strived for over a long period of time. We are grateful to our courts. I mean, if you think about why we're in this position, really three important reasons. One, we've got the most well understood corporate law in the country. We have the best courts in the country, not just Chancery, but our courts overall have been ranked #1 for a long time. We're very proud of that, and excited about the confirmation yesterday by the Senate of the new Chief Justice. And we have a division of corporations which is widely regarded around the country, and for that matter around the world, as being the very best at what they do. And I'll give you one example. A couple of weeks ago, in the midst of one of our many snowstorms, there was a major corporate merger. I think it was in the airline industry. And Secretary Bullock sent me an email that had been sent to him by one of the major New York law firms who had been representing one of the parties. And when it comes to these corporate mergers, timing is incredibly important for the for the markets, for the stock market and the financial markets to understand what's going on, and they really thought, they were very worried about whether or not the merger would happen. But one of the many, many very talented and dedicated state employees, as they often do, went beyond the call of duty that day, somehow managed to effectuate the merger in the middle of this howling snowstorm. And the lawyers reached out to us to say that they had really not seen anything like that before and how grateful they were. So I wanted to give everybody that context, but if I could, Secretary Bullock, ask you to directly answer. What do you do in front of the microphone?
So to answer your question, we're constantly looking at our rate structure and how we can tinker with it, frankly, to raise more revenue. It's a business for us, as you well know. We are not in an expensive state to incorporate in. In fact, we are the most expensive state in America already. I showed you what the lowest rate is, $75, and moving that up to $175. For our upper end, for our Fortune 500 sized companies, it costs $185,000 a year, considerably more than 75, obviously. We raised that rate already once when we needed to, and I thought appropriately in 2009. Other governors have done so during the course of their administration. And it's just a question of balance. And the balance right now, I think, is at this end, and raising this end. Representative, you were an advocate of doing this a number of years ago, you'll recall. And I think we had that discussion then, and I said, maybe not now, because it had just gone up, right? Now it's been 5 years. And I think the time is appropriate now to raise it again. So there's no right or wrong answer. It's just, again, a question of balance, and I think this strikes the right balance.
And I understand that, and I do appreciate the governor and the staff that have come to the conclusion that that money that we are short now can be raised from those who can afford it. I don't mean that to belittle corporations, but there is a certain level of where we had to recover our revenue, and I appreciate the governor's efforts in it.
Governor, in your State of the State address last week, you said, let's stop complaining about the sorry state of our transportation trust fund and fix it. In this budget, you stopped infusing sheet money into the fund, and you're taking nearly $40 million for general operating expenses. So what do you mean by planning to fix it?
Well, I laid out in great detail yesterday the plan to fix it. Let's just talk about the $40 million. That has been nothing more than a patch. That's all it is. And if you look year by year at the escheat money that has gone into the Transportation Trust Fund, last year it was 40, a few years ago it was 0, a few years ago it was 10, it was 24, it was 0 for a couple of years in a row. It's incredibly inconsistent. And that's no way to build a transportation budget. When you look at these kinds of transportation projects that might be in any district of any member of the General Assembly who's here, these are long projects. Many of them are multi-year projects. You simply can't build a multi-year budget on a decision to this year it's going to be 0, this year it's going to be 10, this year it's going to be 40, this year it's going to be 0. And so one of the key recommendations of the Transportation Trust Fund Task Force a couple years ago, which was a bipartisan group made up of members of the General Assembly as well as people from the outside, they said the Transportation Trust Fund needs a sustainable revenue stream, and specifically mentioned that we ought to stop doing it through escheat. So we think the proposal that we laid out yesterday, and I hope that we have the opportunity for members of the General Assembly who are here, we would very much welcome the opportunity to come into your caucuses and talk to you in more detail about it. But we think the proposal, which is to put an additional $100 million a year into the Transportation Trust Fund, made up half of a 10-cent increase in the gas tax and half of a borrowing of $50 million. And what that enables us to do, first of all, it enables us to avoid some really problematic delays or stoppages of projects. It allows us to keep going forward. It allows us to put thousands of people to work. And it allows us to do so in a financially sustainable way. We have been very concerned, and Secretary Batt, I think, has done a great job over the last few years. When he came in, immediately said, our debt level is way too high given the revenues that we collect. It's not sustainable. And we were sort of off the chart in terms of other states. So much of the money that we were bringing in, over 30 cents of every dollar that we were bringing in transportation, was going just to pay debt service. The national average, the accepted national average is about 20 cents. And so he's made great progress at bringing that number back down. So much to the point that if we do raise additional revenue through the gas tax and we borrow in equal measure, $50 million each, we'll be able to add $100 million into the Transportation Trust Fund. We'll actually be able to continue to bring down our debt service to revenue ratio down toward eventually hitting the widely accepted 20%. We will still be under surrounding states. I mean, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and in a different way, Virginia, have done big increases in the gas tax within the last 6 to 9 months. Pennsylvania, even more recently than that. These have not been partisan decisions. And in 2 of those states, we have Republican governors. 1 state, we have a Democratic governor working with members of the General Assembly of both parties. I mean, there's nothing the least bit partisan about infrastructure investment. And so even with this increase, the proposed 10-cent per gallon increase, we would be lower than those surrounding states. And the effect on the average Delawarean would be $4.78 a month. We know that's nothing to sneeze at, but we think, given all of the parameters and the desire that we all have to make sure that our roads and bridges stay in good condition and we continue to make improvements in safety and congestion, that this is a worthwhile investment and an appropriate investment to make.
But why take the $40 million for operating expenses?
Because the $40 million last year was 40. The year before that, a couple years before that was 0. And so to us, it did not make sense. And this is implementing a recommendation of the Transportation Trust Fund Task Force to stop relying on escheat revenues for the transportation budget.
Governor, can you, and actually maybe...
I didn't expect this to be like, all the members of General Assembly and everything else.
Maybe Director Vasali can address it. The recapture of some funds from the special funds. Can you put that in perspective? And you may have, but I didn't catch it well enough. The amounts coming from TTF, from the open space, and from the farmland preservation.
Yes, so the revenue source that would otherwise go to the TTF is a sheet. The open space and ag lands preservation, which is $8 million and $8 million, is revenue from the realty transfer tax. And the final amount coming from the Energy Efficiency Fund is revenue generated from the public utility tax that would otherwise go to that.
I'm saying, if you're taking 8.7 from there, what's there to start with? Are you taking 1%?
So the $40 million that would otherwise go to the trust fund goes to 0. The money that's in ag lands that's normally $10 million goes down to 2. $8 million goes to the general fund. The open space is normally 10. It goes down to 2 for open space, and $8 million goes to the general fund.
So it's more accurate. It's not that you're moving special funds over to the operating, but rather you're putting less into the special funds than was done the current fiscal year.
Correct.
Sorry, thank you.
And this recommendation is
Not new.
Yeah, this recommendation is actually similar to recommendations that we've made in previous January proposals, sometimes when there's been an increase toward the end of the year, and some of that has been restored.
Governor, I want to follow up on Representative Kowalko's question. Weird sense to have had to have said, but can you hone in a little more specifically on, are you worried about having closed so much of this gap on the backs of corporations and what that's going to do to the business climate?
No, so 90%, remember, 90% of that increase is exported to companies outside of Delaware. That's number one. And number two, as I had mentioned in introducing Secretary Bullock, he spends a significant amount of time and effort reaching out to the corporate community that we value so much to sort of take the measure of these proposals. Is that a fair way of?
The other thing I'd add is, we talked about different ways of approaching this issue, how much to raise, fees for alternative entities, what kinds of alternative entities to raise. And as the governor mentioned, we do a lot of outreach to our partners in the private sector, both in the bar, the registered agent community, and whatnot. And these were, I'm not suggesting anybody wants to pay more for anything. I would never do that. But of all the alternatives that were out there, these were the alternatives that they thought were the best. I would not have wanted to do it 3 or 4 years ago when the economy was in recession, but we had our second best year in history last year for entity formation. And the economy, there's just news I was listening on the radio on the way down that they've revised fourth quarter growth for last year to 3.3%. So we're in an upswing economy, and our franchise is very, very healthy. So I'm very comfortable with the recommendation.
I know Representative Potter, Representative Ramon, and Amy had questions, so we'll take those three. I saw them in order of Potter, Ramon, and Amy. So,
Yes,
Charles.
I was glad to see on special programs you had, was that 250 million for reentry?
250,000.
250,000.
Yes.
And so is that an increase? Because I know, I like your speech on doing more about reentry, and I have legislation coming up about Crime Prevention and Rehabilitation Act. So we're in the right direction there. I just want to know, is that an increase over last year?
It is, and it's really, and I think we need to continue, as I mentioned in the State of the State, I think we need to continue to do a better and better job. This is not the sole responsibility of the Department of Correction. We started down this path in 2009 with a partnership between correction, labor, health and social services, transportation. And so I think we need to build on that, and we'll look forward to working with you on some of your ideas as well.
Because, you know, there's extraordinary amount we're paying on people in prison.
Right.
But we need to get them a detox and other programs. We got to go in that direction.
Very consistent with the message in the State of the State. Representative Ramon and then Amy.
Thank you, Governor. You were talking a little bit about Transportation Trust Fund and the sheet money, and I really like the idea of, frankly, putting things as a business person in the categories that it should be in.
Mhm.
But there is still something standing out there that with the fixed expenses in Del Dot, and I know we've had meetings about this in the discussion. Since there's so much focus on trying to get funding for the Transportation Trust Fund, could we begin some sort of a process that maybe even nibbling away at 10 or 20% a year at those fixed expenses from Del Dot and moving them to the general fund and truly incurring tax increases in the areas that they need to be rather than maybe in areas that they affect a lot of people and not need to be?
Well,
Maybe this is the year to start that.
All right, so I know that there's a lot of interest on the part of members of the General Assembly to move some of the operating expenses out of the Transportation Trust Fund and into the general fund. I like that idea. I would love to, as much of the Transportation Trust Fund as possible to be spent on capital projects. Now, what's happened, this is actually something that started under Governor Castle. And so, in a number of governors with a number of members of the General Assembly, bipartisan, have continued to put that operating money into the trust fund. Of course, the challenge is then that creates a problem in the general fund. And so, we are always looking, and I think we are always working hard to find opportunities in the general fund to save. This is why I do want to keep reminding the members of the General Assembly about that number of 530 fewer people than a few years ago. So we are always open and always eager to work with you to identify places to save. But I think it is this is difficult work. But if you're asking me if I support the theory of having as much of the Transportation Trust Fund as possible to be used for capital projects, I do. And I look forward to working with you on that. But what I'm saying is it is not nearly as easy as it sounds, because what it means is we've got to find places in the general fund. Otherwise you're just transferring a problem from one place to the other.
But to follow up, that's what we're doing by moving the sheet money. I agree with the movement of the sheet money, but if we're going to start fixing things like that, which you've obviously begun to do, this would be the next step. And that's, all due respect, I just think it's an opportunity.
And as always, I look forward to opportunities to work with every member of the General Assembly. And I know this is something that Representative Short has brought up to me, and Representative Hudson a number of times. And I think probably people on both sides of the aisle like the idea. Implementing it is a challenge, and we work best when we work together. Amy.
You talked about transportation and infrastructure not being a partisan issue. If lawmakers don't vote to raise the gas tax, what happens?
Then if the proposal that Secretary Batt and I laid out yesterday is not adopted, we are going to have a tiny capital program for the Transportation Trust Fund. It's going to be a $128 million program. And I hope that we do have the opportunity to go into and meet with all of the members of the General Assembly to talk about it, because I think it would be important for each of you to understand what that really means. And we can talk about the extraordinary delay that will mean on basically every project out there. I mean, there really will be very little room to do any new projects. It means we have the threat of, roads that are not getting repaved. It means we have bridges that are not getting fixed as quickly as possible. And I'm not trying to overstate this. I mean, this is just the reality. And so, we have, and we went over this a little bit yesterday in our presentation, and we look forward to the opportunity to share with more. We've got one last question, Representative Moreau, and then I think we'll.
Thank you, Governor. Sometimes the best way to achieve a goal is to do it in phases. And I think that we're all hearing the 10-cent increase in the gasoline tax has not received a very good response, at least initially.
Well, let me just interrupt for a second. We were overwhelmed yesterday by the number of people who came to support us at the announcement. So.
There are two sides of the coin. Having said that, would you consider doing this in phases, doing a 5 cents now and 5 cents the following year?
Well, let me say this. I mean, I think as much as our friends in the media would love it if we were to resolve the entire budget today in this venue, I don't think that's the appropriate thing to do. And I think we have a job to do to communicate with you. And a number of members of the General Assembly were there yesterday, which we appreciated because I think they got to hear the full presentation. We want to share the full presentation with all of you. And in the end, it takes all of us to work together. We think we have a very strong argument to make in terms of increased investment. I know many of you want to see increased investment. I will tell you, I do think it would be a fundamental mistake for us to go back to simply borrow. I think that would be a big problem. I know it's the easiest thing to do, but I think that would be a mistake. But we would very much welcome the opportunity to come into your caucus and to sit down with each of you individually, if that's what you would like, because we think this is so important to every one of our constituents that we'll put as much time into these conversations as it takes. We very much appreciate. Did you have a question, Mike? The very last question.
I see that you've included in your budget a 1% salary increase. Was there any consideration about doing it across the board so that the most vulnerable state employees would receive the larger benefit from it?
It's 1%.
Well, it is across. Right now, the way it is, it's a what?
I'm talking about a flat rate, not just a percentage rate, but a flat dollar amount, so that the most vulnerable would receive a better benefit.
I'd tell you what. I mean, I think what we've done so far, the proposal is for a 1% across the board, and we've obviously identified a specific dollar figure that amounts to. We'll look exactly 15.6, I think. We will look forward to. I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that proposal amongst members of the General Assembly who may want to look at it different ways. And as with everything else, we'll look forward to having those conversations as well. Thank you very much for coming, everybody.